The following is a special video presentation of the Hennepin County Library.
Hi, I'm Scott Benton, and we're going to have a conversation with Doris Kearns Goodwin today, author of the recent story of World War II, No Ordinary Time, the phrase, I believe, from one of Eleanor Roosevelt's comments at the 1940 convention.
Right, indeed.
I have a question I would like to serve up to you because I think it kind of cuts into the subject of this time and these people very handsomely. You comment that Eleanor saw things as they should be done, and that Franklin Roosevelt saw things as they could be done.
Yeah, I think that really does tell a lot about the different temperaments of the two people. Franklin Roosevelt grew up absolutely confident of his position in the world. I mean, his mother had made him feel like nobody was more loved than this child. And as a result, he became in some ways the consummate politician. He could charm anybody. Churchill once said about him that to meet him for the first time with all of his charm and his contagious confidence was like opening your first bottle of champagne. So he gets into the political system and he figures it out. He just understands how to make it work, how to stay maybe like one step ahead of the country, but always understanding what the country would take. He understood the people and how far he could move them. Eleanor was always from the start an idealist. She had grown up under such different circumstances. While there was economic privilege that she shared with Franklin, there was always the sense that she was an outsider. Somehow in her little family, her father was an alcoholic and her mother thought she wasn't a pretty little girl and always made her aware of that. She tells the story of standing outside the parlor when they're young and the two little brothers, handsome, are in her mother's lap, and she doesn't feel welcomed into that room because somehow she'll make it less pretty. So she grows up feeling like she wants to represent those people that are outside the system, push in at that system and make it respond, people who are poor, blacks, migrant workers, and she's always wanting to make the system better. And so that two of them are always up against each other. She's like the agitator and he's the politician, but it worked. I mean, there's somehow that productive nature of the tension between them made their partnership so effective.
Well, I noticed that you do spend a good deal of time in the book, and I think in a very effective way, talking about Eleanor Roosevelt going out into the country, kind of the legs that FDR did not have, to view things that he might not want to take a look at, whether it was a housing problem or a race problem or a daycare problem, and bringing back to him a dose of reality and what actually was happening. And not in the inside the Beltway was not a terminology that was used back in those days, but she managed to get outside of the future Beltway very, very often.
Absolutely.
But it seems to me at the cost of some dysfunctional activity in her family.
Well, there's no question. She traveled maybe 200, 250 days a year, as you say, bringing back stuff to him, an understanding and perception of the country he would never have had on his own. Because most people, even if you're traveling for the president, are going to tell him things are working well, your program's doing great, maybe it needs this minor revision. She would tell him the truth about what was working and what wasn't. And she could bring him an understanding of the people and their needs that he wouldn't have had from Washington. But because she's away so much, he needed somebody to take care of him in Washington. He was a lonely man, especially being a paralyzed man. He was a paraplegic. And the only company that he could have would be people who could talk to him, who could gossip with him, who could relax with him. He couldn't go to the theater to relax. He couldn't take a walk easily. He couldn't play any sports. So he had to fill the White House with people, and that meant other people were taking Eleanor's place.
One of the things that I found in the book fascinating, and maybe it's just because I have a penchant for liking maps, you have a diagram of the second floor of the White House, and it's the family arrangement, who slept in what bedroom, where the studies were. And then there's a moment that apparently is repeated many times of, at the end of a busy day, Franklin asking people into the study, making the drinks himself, and apparently they were not light. There were serious bumps of martinis, and I think he took a great deal of pleasure in that, and having them gather as a family in a give and take. That to me made the human scale And I think that if I were to say one thing that I enjoyed immensely about your book is that I did not think of statesmen. I thought of human beings grappling with these problems.
Well, I'm glad to hear you say that, because that's really in some ways what I was trying to accomplish, is to let the reader feel what it was like to be in the Roosevelt White House. And the reason that diagram was so important at the start is this White House was almost like an extended family. I mean, it wasn't just Eleanor and Franklin in their bedrooms on the second floor. Missy LeHand, his secretary, who was really like his other wife. When Eleanor was away, she's the one that brought the cough medicine if he had a cold. She's the one who was his hostess at the cocktail hour. She's the one, if he were grumpy during the day, that would arrange a poker game at night. She's living right in those family quarters. And then Eleanor's great friend, Lorena Hickok, who had really helped her to become the kind of first lady she was. She was a former AP reporter, and she helped Eleanor to understand that you could make a role other than a ceremonial first lady's role. She's living right next door to Eleanor. Eleanor's good friend Joe Lash is there all the time, and Roosevelt's best friend Harry Hopkins, who he depends on during the war, really as his alter ego. He didn't want him to be away from him, so he asked him to live in the White House too. And then you add to that Winston Churchill coming in and out, and the Princess Martha of Norway, and it really was like a hotel in a certain sense. But as I understand it, because of Roosevelt's paralysis, because of that need for company, he loved having that kind of gay, spirited conversation around him all the time. And as you say, all these people would gather in the study at night, and the rule was you weren't allowed to talk politics. You were only allowed to tell stories or gossip about the movies. Eleanor always had a hard time with that, because she would come in and couldn't help herself but talk about slum clearance or civil rights and not ever really quite enjoy the playfulness, which is really what he needed.
There was that problem of not being able to cross over very well into each other's world, and there's one, I think, a poignant moment. It was when Churchill was visiting the White House during Christmas of '41, after Pearl Harbor, and Eleanor was walking along a hallway and looked in, and the president had asked that one room be put together as kind of a war room. And because Churchill had one like
Right,
it, and he liked the
one
idea. So they put one together for him with maps and diagrams and so forth, and a table. And she looked in, and there was Franklin and Winston sitting around that table, moving lines, moving the pins on the map, discussing in an animate way like two boys playing with toy soldiers.
Exactly. That's what she said. And I think what it meant is that she was always aware during the war that the end result of war was killing, that people would die. I think when you get caught up in a war and the glory and the excitement of war, you get excited at home, especially about the production at home. America was amazingly productive during this period of time, and especially for the people on the home front. You had to keep reminding yourself that there's also something sad and terrible that's going on with this war that has taken us out of the Depression and made us powerful again. And he obviously had to think about winning that war first, anything that he could do to win that war. And he and Churchill were absolutely at one with that. But when she has that comment of seeing that they're like little boys playing soldier, it's almost like standing back from the whole enterprise and saying, but let's remember the suffering that this war is entailing. And she's always that way throughout the entire war. She'll visit the wounded soldiers. She'll keep that sadness at the top of her heart, which is a good reminder to the kind of military excitement that can envelop people during a war.
I was glad in your book to be kind of reintroduced to Eleanor, because I'd always admired her. But today, with a Hillary Clinton being very much a factor in her husband's administration, to look back at that time, what is this, 50-odd years ago now, and see her, Eleanor Roosevelt, being such a force with her daily column, with her radio reports, with, in effect, initiating legislation, at least the idea, the concepts behind a lot of legislation. And I did not know how effective she was at beginning the healing process of, in the racial problem with A. Philip Randolph of the sleeping car porters and Walter White and all of those people that were such a factor in the early days of the Black Power, if you will, movement before that phrase was invented. I wondered, in thinking of her in that context and doing the things she was doing and having the private life she had, what would happen if the news media had not, or if they were like they are today?
Oh, I've thought about that so often. I mean, To be sure, there were many white Southerners who resented a lot that Eleanor was so far out ahead of her time on civil rights. I mean, and letters would come into Roosevelt saying, "Can't you muzzle that wife of yours? She just talks too much." Or it was amazing, every time she went into the South, there would be rumors that something called the Eleanor clubs were set up by black maids in honor of Eleanor. Suddenly, the white mistress of the house would come to dinner, an extra plate would be set, say to the maid, "Who's coming to dinner tonight?" And she would presumably say, "Oh, I've joined the Eleanor club, and she says I'm supposed to eat with you from now on." It wasn't even true, but it was such a mark of how Eleanor had entered the imagination of people on both sides. But even with all of that criticism that was aimed at her, by the end of the 12 years that she was First Lady, the country had grown to an enormous respect. They at least recognized that here this woman was consistently calling for action on behalf of poor, blacks, migrant workers, unions, etc. And there was a grudging sense that she is who she is. And it was like 80% approval rating. Suppose it had been today. Suppose you had the people who were opposed to her, say the white Southerners, able to finance right-wing talks somewhere or be out among the radio. Suppose that you had the press looking into these unconventional relationships in the White House and saying to Eleanor, "Why are you traveling so much? Your secretary has become his other wife, Missy LeHand." Or saying, "What is this relationship of yours with this former AP reporter, Lorena Hickok? It's looking mighty strange." I talked to an old reporter and he said, "You know, standards were just different in those days. Unless the activities of the private lives of the public figures impinged on their public behavior, it wasn't our business." He said, "We knew our lives weren't perfect, so who were we to be passing judgment?" And in a certain sense, the toleration that the country had without knowing for this kind of private life gave the Roosevelt family the source of the energy they needed to be the leaders they were. It would have been a large loss for us if we'd been constantly beating down on these unconventional relationships and didn't allow them to continue.
There is a comment in your book about occasionally a reporter, if he sees another photographer attempt to take a picture of Roosevelt's legs to show that he was indeed a paraplegic, they would move between the camera and the president just to protect him.
Isn't that an amazing thing to think, that unspoken code of honor, that somehow the photographers didn't want to shoot the president looking helpless? Numberless times they would see him being carried from a car up some stairs into a building. They never took a picture of that. No newsreel ever showed that. Another occasion in 1936, when he was going to deliver the Democratic acceptance speech at the convention, he actually fell on the way up the aisle. His braces unsnapped, his speech fell all over the floor. The Secret Service picked him up, they snapped his braces back into place, and he went up and delivered this great speech, the Rendezvous with Destiny speech. Did a reporter ever talk about the fall? No, they simply talked about the speech itself. Compare that with recently when President Bush went over to Japan, and somehow we saw him being sick over and over again on the nightly news. There really was a decorum to the presidency, a dignity. And Roosevelt helped to establish it. I mean, he knew not to be out there in front of the people too often. Those fireside chats, he would limit them deliberately so that each one was a dramatic moment. But the press also knew how to keep that space. And I think it was a better time.
I'd like to get at a little bit the process of becoming a historian, or let's say the process of writing a history. How long did it take you to put this together?
Well, the embarrassing thing is the war covers like 5 years, right, in our history from 40 to 45 when we really begin to get involved. And it took me 6 years to write the book, so longer than the war itself.
That's
and the
concept to manuscript?
Yes, probably 7 from concept to manuscript. But the war itself, as I say, took so much research to try and figure out what Eleanor and Franklin were doing, what was happening on the home front, and what was happening on the war. I really had 3 stories to tell. And luckily, there were so many people still alive that wouldn't have been 10 years from now. There were enough documents in the Roosevelt Library, which I lived in for periods of time, or so it seemed. They had saved everything there. There were letters that Eleanor had written. I mean, people don't write letters the same way today, but she would write letters until 3 a.m. to dozens of friends, and all those letters were in the library. All the memos between the two of them back and forth were there, and of course all of his speeches. You could listen to his radio addresses. I mean, that's what's so wonderful about having a library to spend so much time in.
You say the Roosevelt Library?
That's right, in Hyde Park, New York.
And is that where you spent most of the time in terms of this, or were there other sources that you used?
Well, most of the documentary material that related to the Roosevelt story was in that library. But then in addition to that, I was able to find probably, several dozen people who had known the Roosevelts personally, and I went to interview those people. I mean, it was amazing to me they were still alive. There had been a black butler in the White House. Tip O'Neill actually knew him and put me in touch with him before Tip died, and he was there when Churchill arrived in the White House and told me this great story of the morning after Churchill first came, right after Pearl Harbor. Churchill approached the butler in the morning and said to him, "Now listen, I have a few rules for you because I'm going to be here for 3 weeks. Number 1, no whistling outside my room. Number 2, no talking in the corridor. And number 3, I need wine, brandy, champagne, all sorts of scotch before I get through my days here." I could never have known that if it hadn't been for him. So too, I was able to find the doctor who was with Roosevelt when he died, interview 2 of the Roosevelt children before they died, and then their children in turn, who were really helpful in opening family papers to me. So it's like a detective process. I think in some ways the most useful tool that I found was one of the most pedestrian ones. The White House ushers' diaries are kept every day describing what the President and the First Lady did. Wake up at 7, massage at 7:15, breakfast at 8, lunch with Stimson, lunch with Ickes, various cabinet members. Once I had that as my beginning chronological base, I could then go to the diaries, say, of Stimson or Ickes or Morgenthau and find out what they said at lunch that day. Or if I knew that Eleanor had met with her friend Joe Lash, he had a diary, and I could go to that. Or I could look at her columns. Her columns a few days later, which she wrote every day, would reflect a conversation prior to that. So it was like piecing together this chronology so you could feel what it was like to live in that White House at that time. It was fun.
I'm going to throw a phrase at you that apparently we talked about it earlier, the Justice Holmes comment, that Franklin Roosevelt had a second-class intellect and a first-class temperament.
Well, I think what that was meant to say is that his brain was somewhat disorderly, disorganized, and not the finest intellectual quality, but that his temperament in the sense of his character, his understanding of the people, his leadership was first class. I think his actual mind was even better than a second-class mind. Just from listening to what he was able to read and absorb, he had a fantastic memory. I think what it was that he enjoyed playing with decisions for a while, and so sometimes he would seem to be very disorganized and going in a lot of different directions. But I mean, he's the one that came up with the whole idea of Lend-Lease. If that's not a brilliant idea, a way of figuring out how to bring our isolationist country to support England at a time before we were really ready to, the Lend-Lease concept made it seem so simple, so neighborly, and it worked somehow. So I think he had actually a first-class mind and a first-class temperament.
A man who devotes his life to politics, not just FDR, but just about anybody, and I guess that it's a 90 or 100-hour-a-week job and you live away from your home a lot, seems to draw away from family. And you make some comments, more than comments, and analysis and quotes and so forth, about the fact that Franklin Roosevelt as a political entity, as a political machine, was withdrawn from family and normal relationships, not just because of his legs, but because of his job and the fact that he was governor of a major state for a long time and then president longer than anybody else.
It's true. I mean, Eleanor felt that there was ultimately a reserve in her husband that didn't allow him to really open up to anyone, including her and the children. I mean, I think she would probably date it way back to his relationship with his mother, where the mother was so loving of him but so controlling that in order to get away from her, like when he went to Harvard, she got a townhouse in Boston to be near him. When they got married, she got adjoining townhouses in New York, one for her, one for Eleanor and Franklin, and the door went in between. In order to escape this influence, Roosevelt developed a kind of secrecy, a sense of being his own man, and then politics just reinforces that. You're in a game, you're in a competition, there's nobody you can fully trust. Now, Roosevelt had a charming exterior. It wasn't that he wasn't charming with everybody who came to him, and he could make them talk to him, but he rarely talked to them about what was really on his mind and on his heart. Maybe he did with Harry Hopkins a little bit, maybe a little bit with Missy LeHand. And eventually, with one of his 5 children, Anna, he brought her into the White House after Missy had a stroke in the middle of the war. And with Anna, he developed a real closeness. But with the 4 sons, it was never easy. I mean, I suspect it's never easy to be the child of somebody who's so giant. You're shadowed, really, by that giant oak. And add to that the problems that Eleanor had, not feeling at ease bringing up children when they were young because she'd never had good mothering herself. Those kids did not have an easy time. And I think there's something to it. Eleanor said maybe that's what made him such a good public leader, that he wasn't attached to all these people in any intimate way. But I think it also left him very lonely. I kept wishing I could push him together with people all along the way.
Yeah, I wonder, have you ever thought of writing a nonfiction?
Well, you know, what happens when you are an
I've got a
historian
follow-up question on this.
what happens is you do think you know what these people are thinking and feeling, but as a good historian, you cannot go over that line unless you have documentary evidence, so you pull yourself back. But then you're just thinking, if I were writing fiction, I could go over that line. I would know my character, know what they're thinking. Someday, I'd probably have to set it back in time so I could do research, because I wouldn't feel comfortable unless I had a lot of research. But it would be wonderful to have the liberty of really going inside the hearts and minds and not have to feel constrained, because I don't think good historians should do that.
I certainly agree to that, but I also think that part of the tools that a good historian, like yourself and a lot of others we could mention, brings is an understanding and an appreciation of the telling detail that has a poignance in and of itself, and the novelist part of the mind could go with it. And I'm going to bring up one to me that was terribly surprising, in a way, that at Hyde Park there was a long table in the dining room, and at one end sat Franklin Roosevelt, and at the other sat his mother Sarah, and his wife had to catch whatever chair was available at that table.
Exactly. Doesn't that tell you a lot about that whole set of relationships? I mean, I agree with you. I think what makes a good piece of history is the same attention to the little details that bring to life the characters. I mean, that's what you're looking for. You might do hundreds of hours of research to find that one detail. I mean, the other one that's like that, in a sense, at the big house where Sarah Roosevelt lived, everything is formal. It's beautiful. Everything matches. This big library, old-fashioned antiques. You go to Eleanor's cottage, which Roosevelt built for her, nothing matches, none of the china matches. She wanted it to be comfortable. And you look in the living room, every chair is a different size. And the reason is that she wanted everybody of different sizes and weights to feel comfortable in their own little chairs. So you can really tell sometimes the way a person is feeling about the world from certain kind of details, and I search for them forever.
You, of course, have had a good run at I would say 20th century history, because really the Kennedys and the Fitzgeralds, or Fitzgeralds and the Kennedys, started at the turn of the century or before.
Right.
And you're getting a grasp. You're looking ahead. Is it the period or the people that are your first interest?
Well, it's interesting. The next book I'm going to do, which I'm going to do with my husband, Richard Goodwin, who worked in the White House under Kennedy and Johnson, we're going to do a book together on presidential decisions. So part of it is what I've been used to, the presidency, but it's going to go way back in time, starting with Washington, coming all the way up to the present, taking about 15 decisions and telling each one as a story, like Truman firing MacArthur, Johnson getting the Civil Rights Bill through the Congress, and Lincoln at Fort Sumter, Jackson and the bank. And we're hoping that by putting them together, it'll be like a history of the presidency, and we're hoping it'll be a kind of college textbook. I would love kids to love history as much as I do someday.
Almost like that's kind of an echo, well, not an echo, because it goes beyond Profiles in Courage.
Right, but that same idea of making a live study of these decisions and showing what it really felt like to be part of it at the time, and then stringing them together. Yeah.
I read a fair amount of presidential biography, and I'm going to bring up two that I've read recently that are older biographies and out of print, and without putting down them too hard. Not very good. One on Millard Fillmore and one on John Garfield. And I bring them up because they were slender volumes and so forth, and these were men who did not make large decisions while they were in office. But it seems to me that in looking back at that period, it is somewhat difficult to get in, because the volume of material that is available to someone, let's say, writing a book about Millard Fillmore, who admittedly is a joke, kind of, shouldn't be, but he's modest, let's say, in the scheme of things. Nevertheless, today you had not only a presidential library to go to, but you could have presumably gone to any number of major, in the Library of Congress or whatever library, that had so much research you could hardly get through it to find what you want to get. Is it in form now that an historian like yourself can retrieve it in a convenient way, or is it a laborious task?
Well, it's getting better. I mean, I think as these libraries begin to put onto computers what's in their actual holdings, eventually it's going to be a lot easier than it is now. I'm still in the sort of old-fashioned primitive style of just going to the card catalog in these libraries and seeing what's categorized in different kinds of books and then going through it all and spending day after day taking notes on it. But now you can actually Xerox some of the materials in the library and bring it home with you, so you don't have to take all the notes in it. That's new. When I started the Kennedy book, you couldn't do that. You just had to take notes on everything. So the modern world is intruding into the library system. But what I don't know about yet until I get to the pre-Civil War of this new book is what really has been saved. That'll be at the National Archives and in the Washington Library of Congress. But I've read wonderful books on Andrew Jackson, for example, in Washington, and they seem to have letters, they seem to have memos. Things are around, so it's just a matter of finding them all.
We are fortunate, I think, because other than the Civil War, and the North wasn't really touched too hard, the archives were not damaged. And I bring this up just as an aside, but to address that problem. I was doing some research on a book in Mexico, and it was pre-French invasion from the 1840s in our war. And I was in their National Archive. And I said, what have you got, and so forth, where is it? And their answer was, gee, we don't have a lot.
Oh, boy.
And I said, why? And he said, well, when the French invaded, we were short of all kinds of materials, and we bailed the National Archives and used them as defenses before the cannon.
Oh, my
and they
God,
were destroyed by cannon fire.
Oh, wow.
And that if you want anything prior to 1862 in the Battle of Puebla, you're going to have a tough time.
Your heart must have sunk when you heard that.
It did. But I think of not only the presidential libraries around here, but I have had the good luck to even find things over the counter in a public library. Even here, I was asking about a book from the 1840s, and I got the original book.
Oh, how exciting.
Handed to me as if it was the latest Danielle Steele.
Right.
You can't keep it as long because we had to borrow it from a university, but there it is, and then it might even be from the library of the individual that I was going to do some research on. Have you gone to public libraries or to other sources and had that kind of magic moment?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, especially doing the Fitzgeralds and the Kennedys, the Boston Public Library was an invaluable source. They actually had the old plot plans where the house that Fitzgerald had grown up in would be recorded in the Boston Library, or they had the actual city directory, so you knew who lived on what streets way back in the 1870s, or they had on record he'd gone to Boston Latin School, the exams that you had to take to get into the Latin School back in 1868. I mean, that kind of keeping of records for an historian just makes your heart swell. It's so wonderful. I will still hope that we'll always have people around who will care about the past, so let's hope that it'll never go away.
Well, Doris, I have certainly enjoyed talking with you on the subject of your new book, No Ordinary Time, a look at World War II America as seen through the prism of the family arrangements in the White House and all of those rich and lovely characters that made up part of our fairly recent history.
Right.
I like to say that at my age. And we appreciate very much your coming to see us.
Oh, thank you. It was a great pleasure for me.
And we wish you every good luck because it's a dandy book. And if you like history, take a look.
Thank you.
A presentation of the Hennepin County Library.